had older people tell me how lucky I am to be so young, how I have my whole life ahead of me. And while I believe them, it doesn't make life while you're young any easier. Sometimes the future just seems so uncertain. I recently got to meet Dr. Ben Carson. He had a few hurdles to overcome early in life, but where he ended up, well, I'll let him tell that story. I'm so glad you're here today. I just finished reading your book and I really loved it. And in particular, I was surprised to find out that though you're now a world-renowned neurosurgeon, you weren't always a straight-A student.
Well, I was known as the dummy. I was the butt of all the jokes. I didn't think I was smart, and everybody else concurred with that assessment. But you know, the thing that really turned it around was my mother. She only had a third-grade education, but you know, she prayed to God for wisdom, and God gave her the wisdom to turn off the TV and make us read books. And I didn't like it very much, I have to admit. My brother didn't either, but once we started reading books, particularly about people of accomplishment, I began to understand that the person who has the most to do with what happens to you in life is you. I began to get excited about learning. And within the space of a year and a half, I went from the bottom of the class to the top of the class. It really changed my perspective on who I was and what life was all about.
How did growing up in poverty affect you?
Well, you know, some people hate spiders, rats, snakes. I hated poverty. I couldn't stand it. I thought for sure I had been born into the wrong family. But the good thing was, you know, my mother worked so hard to try to provide the basics that we needed, and she knew how to stretch every dollar. She would drive us out in the country on a Sunday, knock on a farmer's door, and say, "Can we pick 4 bushels of your corn or your beans or your apples? 3 for you and 1 for us." Well, they always liked that deal. And then she would bring the stuff home and can it. She would go to the Goodwill, buy a shirt that had a big hole in the elbow, and buy a couple of patches and put one on each elbow, and people would be saying, "Where'd you get that shirt? That's really nice." You know, she just knew how to stretch every dollar. And you know, that helped, but there was never money for anything. And you know, we would go to the store, my brother and I would be asking for bubble gum or candy, and you know, the answer was always the same: we don't have money for that kind of stuff. But she wanted to get it for us, and you could see the pain in her eyes, and pretty soon we didn't want to see the pain in her eyes, so we just stopped asking for the stuff. But you know, you learn to really appreciate things with that level of poverty, and you learn how to really stretch everything. And it is possible to survive all of that, but it also makes you much more sensitive to that. And that's one of the reasons that, you know, my wife and I, you know, spend a lot of our resources trying to help people, you know, get out of those situations. You know, there are a lot of poor people in our nation, and we don't do them any good, to be honest with you, by just giving them stuff. That just creates dependency. What we have to do is create ladders of opportunity so that people can ascend. And the opportunities exist to do that. We have to create the right mindset and make sure that people understand that investing in your fellow American is really an investment in your future as well.
Now, you went from high school in inner city Detroit to Yale. What was that transition like from you going from being kind of a big fish in a smaller pond?
It was a pretty drastic change, because in high school, you know, I could study for half an hour before a test and get an A. And I went to college thinking that I was perhaps the smartest person in the world, and if not, certainly in the top 5. But it didn't take long before I was thinking I was one of the dumbest people in the world. And, you know, it just really wasn't working for me, utilizing the techniques that I had used before. And at the end of the first semester, I was doing so poorly in so many subjects, but particularly chemistry. And you can't do poorly in chemistry and get into medical school. And the night before the final, I just prayed and I said, "Lord, I always thought you wanted me to be a doctor. and yet it looks like I'm going to fail chemistry, which means I won't get into medical school. So could you please tell me what it is you really want me to do? Or alternatively, and preferably, work a miracle. And I dreamed that night of myself in a large auditorium just by myself with a nebulous figure working out chemistry problems on the blackboard. And I awakened early that morning. It was so vivid, the dream was. I got my book out, I looked up the stuff that I had dreamed about. Lo and behold, when I went to the exam the next day, it was all the stuff I had dreamed about. And I aced the exam. And I just knew at that point that God truly wanted me to go into medicine. I said, Lord, you'll never have to do that for me again. I'm going to learn how to study. And I did.
You talked in your book about being a bit prideful as a high schooler, and now you often credit God when you talk about your successes. What changed that for you?
Well, I began to realize, particularly as I was a budding neurosurgeon, that maybe some of the stuff that was happening wasn't because of me. And there was a particular case of a little boy from Georgia who had what appeared to be an inoperable brain stem tumor. And they'd been seen all over the place, and they ended up at Hopkins, and the family said, the Lord led us here because we would find a Christian neurosurgeon who could help our son. And I said, there's nothing that I or anybody else can do about this. This is not something that's curable by surgery. And they said, but doctor, the Lord is going to heal our son. He's going to use you to do it. Well, make a long story short, that boy ended up walking out of the hospital and today is a minister. And one of the oncologists said, I used to be an atheist before that case, and that's what converted me. But more importantly, I came to the understanding that it wasn't me, that there was a higher power than myself. And I just said to God at that point, you be the neurosurgeon, I'll be the hands. And that's when all these amazing things began to happen.
Early in your life, you overcame a lot of obstacles. What would you say to a teenager facing some of those same obstacles today?
I would say that there is no one who doesn't have obstacles in their life. Even Bill Gates has obstacles. He's got to figure out how to keep all that money. So, everybody's got problems. And it really is how you face those problems. If you allow it to be an insurmountable wall, then you become the victim. And if you say, this is a piece of cake, I'm finding my way over, under, around, or through this obstacle, one way or another, and you gear yourself to solutions. And that's always the answer. Always be thinking about how I can do something rather than why I can't do something.
You challenge teenagers to think big. What do you mean by think big?
Well, each one of those letters means something special. The T is for talent, which God gives to everybody. And everybody has their own unique set of talents. Develop those, use them, and let those carry you where they will. The H is for honesty. If you lead a clean and honest life and you don't have a bunch of skeletons in the closet, it's really hard for them to come out if you don't put them in there. And it really uncomplicates your life quite substantially. The I is for insight, which comes from listening to people who've already gone where you're trying to go. A lot of the adults in your life have been through the very things that you're going through right now. And if you can talk to them and see what lessons they learned, maybe you don't have to repeat the same things. And maybe that will allow you to move much further and faster than they did. The N is for nice. Be nice to people. Because once they get over their suspicion of why you're being nice, they'll be nice to you. And you can get so much more done when you're being nice, when they're being nice. And not get caught up in the meanness and the selfishness that is promoted by many segments of our society. The K is for knowledge, which is the way that you make yourself more valuable. And no one else can do that for you. You have to actively participate in the process of becoming knowledgeable. And the mechanism for doing that is the next letter, B, books. Some people say, I don't like reading books. Besides that, I can learn anything I need to learn from watching DVDs and videos. But that's like saying that you can develop your muscles by watching somebody else lift weights. It doesn't work that way. You have to exercise your brain if you want it to work for you, and reading is a perfect way of doing that. The second I is for in-depth learning. Learning for the sake of knowledge and understanding, as opposed to just learning some answers so that you can put them down on a quiz. That superficial learning doesn't last very long. And the last letter, G, is for God, which is such an important part of each of us as individuals and the fabric of our nation. And we make a grave error when we allow the secular progressive movement to push God out of our lives. We shouldn't try to force God on them, but by the same token, we should not allow them to remove God from our lives.
You spend a lot of your book talking about education, but it's not just about education. You're also telling young people how to develop strong character. How do those two go hand in hand?
Well, if you have someone who is well educated, who also is a good person, you have a tremendous tool to improve the society in which you live. And that's why, part of education is character education. We are starting to be weary of character education because we say, well, who gets to decide what's right and what's wrong? This is the very same thing that the Roman Empire did before their fall. They had their long, white-robed guys with the long beards who could wax eloquently on every subject. Nothing was right. Nothing was wrong. Everything was relative. They completely forgot who they were. They lost their identity. They lost their nation. And we don't want to repeat that same thing. We need to grasp our identity. And we look at our founding document, the Declaration of Independence. It talks about certain inalienable rights given to us by our Creator, aka God. We look at the Pledge of Allegiance to our flag. It says we are one nation under God. You take a dollar bill out of your wallet, or a $5 bill, or 10, or 20, or 50, or 100, or a quarter, or a nickel, or a dime, or a penny. They all say, in God we trust. So how in the world, when we have it throughout the fabric of our society, can we now yield to those who say, throw that out? That's like taking out the baseline stitch in a garment and not expecting it to fall apart. That's exactly what's happening to our nation.
Your book also talks about making tough decisions. What advice would you give to someone who has to choose between two tough things?
Again, I would say pray and ask God for wisdom. Take advantage of the resources around you. Talk to people who've made the one decision and people who've made the other decision. See where it took them. Ask yourself, is that something that appeals to you, or is that something that would be absolutely repulsive to you? And again, that's why we have these very complex brains. Hence the title, Do You Have a Brain? Use it. If you use it appropriately, a whole lot of problems can be resolved in your life.
What's the main takeaway from your book? What do you hope young people get from reading it?
The main takeaway is the person who has the most to do with what happens to you in life is you. It's not somebody else. It's not the environment. It's not the circumstances into which you were born. It is what you actively decide that you want for your life and how much energy you decide to put behind it. But nobody else can control your life except you.
Dr. Carson, your story and your message are so inspiring. Thank you for spending time with me today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
Am I thinking big enough? Why not think bigger? And the obstacles I see in my life, why let them hold me back? Dr. Carson challenged me that the person who has the most control over my life is me. It's time to start thinking really big.